Have you ever wondered how true is the story behind Calabar's twin-killing reform? Let's get right into it. There's a statue in Calabar of a Scottish woman carrying two babies in her arms. Streets are named after her. Schools are named after her. For over a century, Nigerian children have opened their history textbooks to the same sentence. Mary Slessor stopped the killing of twins. It's a good story. Clean. A single heroine, a single villain, superstition, and a happy ending. But surprisingly, it's also not what happened. By the time Mary Slessor set foot in Calabar in 1876, the campaign against twin killing was already 27 years old. Kings had signed treaties about it. British gunboats had opened fire over it. Missionaries had been rescuing infants from the bush for a quarter of a century before she, Mary Slessor, ever learned to speak a word of ethic. Now the question is, so if she didn't stop it, who did? And why does almost nobody know their names? To understand this story, you have to understand Calabar before any of these outsiders arrived, Efik and British alike. In the early to mid-1800s, the Efik people of the Cross River region held a belief, common across several West African societies, that the birth of twins was unnatural, a spiritual disruption rather than a biological event. One twin, it was believed, had to have been fathered by an evil spirit. The mother was seen as tainted by the encounter. The children themselves were treated not as human infants, but as omens, carriers of misfortune that, if left unaddressed, would bring calamity on the entire community. The response, in practice, was brutal. Twin infants were abandoned in what was known locally as the bad bush, left to die of exposure or be taken by animals. Mothers were frequently cast out alongside them, blamed and even shunned. This is worth sitting with for a second, because the instinct in retelling this story is to reach for a single explanation, primitive superstition, and move on. But fear-driven infanticide, tied to notions of ritual contamination, existed across many pre-modern societies, Europe included. What made Calabar's version historically significant wasn't the belief itself. It's the decades-long, multi-party, and the often violent process it took to unwind it. That process is the real story, and it starts almost 30 years before Mary Slessor's ship ever left Scotland. In 1849, the British Crown appointed a man named John Beecroft as consul for the Bights of Benin and Biafra, effectively Britain's chief political officer along that stretch of coast. Beecroft was not a missionary. He was a career maritime administrator, previously governor of the Spanish island of Fernando Po, and his job was to protect and expand British trade. Palm oil, by this point, had replaced the slave trade as the region's main export. But Beecroft also worked closely with local rulers, and that same year he brokered an agreement with two of the most powerful Efik monarchs of the era, King Eo II of Creek Town and King Archibong I of Duke Town, to formally ban human sacrifice and the killing of twins in Old Calabar. This is the first documented organized attempt to end the practice, 27 years before Slessor arrived. It didn't hold. The people of Old Town, one of the constituent towns of the wider Calabar polity, kept the practice alive and tensions escalated. By January 1855, a British warship, the HMS Antelope, shelled and destroyed Old Town outright, acting, according to Britain's own parliamentary record, at the request of the British consul, on the grounds that the chiefs had broken their treaty. A town was destroyed by naval bombardment, in part over the enforcement of an anti-infanticide treaty. Anyways, later that same year, a second and more durable agreement was signed, this time with King Duke Ephraim and a wider council of Efik chiefs, again promising to abolish the killing of twins in Old Calabar. That's 1855. Mary Slessor was probably 7 years old, still in Dundee, Scotland, working in a jute mill. So before we even get to missionaries, the first chapter of this reform effort belongs to African monarchs negotiating, and in the Old Town case, having force used against their people under a British consul's watch. This wasn't reform arriving on a single ship. It was already a political battlefield. The United Presbyterian Church of Scotland had been active in Calabar since 1846, 3 decades before Slessor. The founding figure of that mission was the Reverend Hope Waddell, who arrived with a small team that included the Reverend Samuel Edgerly and the Reverend Hugh Goldie. Goldie is a particularly important name here, because he's the man who would later teach a young Mary Slessor to speak Efik fluently, a skill history often credits to her alone, as though she arrived already fluent, already embedded. She didn't. She inherited decades of missionary groundwork, language documentation, and relationship building that predated her by a generation. But it's Edgerly whose name deserves far more attention than it gets. In 1852, 24 years before Slessor's arrival, Reverend Edgerly and his wife carried out what's recorded as the first documented twin rescue in Calabar's history in Old Town. When the practice continued there alongside other ritual killings, Edgerly pushed for military intervention, the same pressure campaign that arguably fed into the 1855 bombardment. It's an uncomfortable thread to pull on, and it should be. The Edgerly's compassion for individual infants was real, but their method of enforcement, inviting British gunboats to discipline an African town, was also colonial coercion, dressed in the language of moral rescue. Both things are true at once. That tension doesn't get resolved in this story. It just sits there, the way it actually happened. By the time Slessor set foot in Calabar, the mission had operated for 30 years, run schools, translated scripture into Efik, and built the institutional relationships with Efik royalty that made her later work in Okoyong possible at all. She stood on a foundation. She didn't pour it. If there's one figure this story owes the most overdue correction to, it's King Eo Honesty II of Creek Town. Eo II was one of the most influential Efik monarchs of the 19th century, a shrewd political operator who balanced British commercial pressure, the internal power of the Ekpe secret society, and his own authority as king. He was the same King Eo who co-signed that 1849 treaty with Beecroft. But his influence didn't stop at treaty signatures. Over the following years, King Eo II used his standing within Efik governance, including his authority in matters the Ekpe society itself policed, to actively work toward eliminating twin killing, along with human sacrifice and the practice of killing slaves to accompany a deceased dignitary across much of Calabar. Here's what makes his role so significant and so different from the missionary narrative. Eo II never converted to Christianity. He died in 1858, still practicing Efik tradition, still resistant to full British religious and political interference. He's on record objecting to British meddling in state affairs, even as he cooperated on trade and on ending specific practices he'd come to see as harmful. He wasn't reforming his society because a foreign missionary told him to. He was doing it as an Efik ruler, exercising Efik authority on Efik terms. He died 18 years before Mary Slessor ever arrived in Calabar. By the time she landed, the man most directly responsible for suppressing twin killing across much of the territory had already been dead for nearly 2 decades, and his name had already begun disappearing from the story. None of this is to say Mary Slessor's role was nothing. It wasn't, but it's important to be precise about what it actually was. Slessor arrived in Calabar in 1876, and unusually for a missionary of her era, chose not to stay within the mission compound. She moved inland to Okoyong, learned Efik fluently, adopted local dress, and lived in close daily proximity to the communities she worked among, which earned her a level of trust that more distant missionaries never achieved. In Okoyong specifically, a region the earlier Calabar-based reform agreements hadn't fully reached, she personally rescued twin infants from abandonment, built a home that sheltered them, and took in mothers who'd been cast out with their children. And critically, she was eventually appointed vice president of the native court in Okoyong, a position that gave her actual legal authority to enforce the ban on twin killing in that specific territory, rather than relying purely on persuasion. That's a genuine, hands-on, sustained contribution. It's just a regional continuation of a fight that had already been running for decades in the wider Calabar area, using tools, courts, treaties, local rescue networks that other people had already built or pioneered. The difference between the woman who continued and extended an existing reform into a new territory and the woman who single-handedly stopped the killing of twins in Nigeria is not a small difference. It's the entire distortion this video is trying to correct. So, why does one white missionary's name survive in the textbooks, while Beecroft's treaty, Edgley's rescue, and King Eo honesty, the second and decades of quiet enforcement, mostly did not? Part of it is simple documentation. Missionary societies in Scotland kept extensive records, wrote biographies, published pamphlets. Slessor became a celebrated figure back in Britain during her own lifetime, mythologized in missionary literature designed, in part, to raise funds and justify continued evangelical expansion. Part of it is structural. Colonial era and early post-colonial historical writing tended to center European actors as the agents of change and African rulers as either obstacles or passive beneficiaries, even when, as with King Eo, the African ruler was demonstrably the more consistent and longer-serving reformer. And part of it is simply how myths work. A single heroine with a clean redemption arc is easier to teach, easier to carve into a statue, easier to name a street after than a messy, decades-long, multi-actor process involving 2 kings, 3 missionaries, a naval bombardment, and a secret society's internal politics. The truth was inconvenient for a tidy narrative, so the tidy narrative won. Here's the thread connecting all of it, and it's the part that rarely makes it into the retellings. Almost every formal step in this reform, the 1849 treaty, the Old Town bombardment, the 1855 agreement, happened alongside, not separately from, Britain's steady political and military absorption of the Cross River region. The same John Beecroft, who negotiated the anti-twin killing treaty, was, in that same stretch of years, using naval force to reshape leadership in Lagos and impose British-run trade courts across the Niger Delta. By 1884, the region would be formally declared the Oil Rivers Protectorate, a British colonial holding in all but name. This is what historians mean by gunboat diplomacy, reform, and conquest, delivered by the same ships, often in the same breath. The treaties that ended one form of violence were frequently backed by the threat, and sometimes the reality of another. Moral reform and imperial expansion moved forward hand in hand, not because they were the same thing, but because in 19th century Calabar, they were never fully separable. That doesn't erase the fact that lives were saved. It complicates how we should feel about who saved them and why. So, Who stopped the killing of twins in Nigeria? The honest answer is, nobody did it alone, and it took far longer than one woman's lifetime. It took King Eo II treaty in 1849. It took Ejeli's rescue in 1852. It took a British warship's cannon in 1855. It took King Eo Honesty, the second quiet, unconverted authority inside his own court, for years after the missionaries had gone home. And yes, it took Mary Slessor finishing a fight in Okoyong that had already been fought in other rooms for a generation before she arrived. History is like a single name on a statue. Reform is rarely that simple. It's slower, messier, and shared by more people than the plaque ever says. Would you like to know about the significance of the Calabar Carnival that was a means of tourism? How and why it was started? Hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up.